Welcome to this McKinsey Global Institute virtual event.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Olivia White. I'm a senior partner and a director of McKinsey Global Institute. We're really excited for today's session, where we're going to discuss the findings from a new MGI report, which is called Advancing Adaptation from Cooling to Coastal Defenses. And then most importantly, we'll start to talk about how we turn those findings into action. It's the latest of multiple McKinsey Global Institute reports on the energy transition and on climate-related topics, and we're very, very excited about its coming out at this point. So the run of the show today, we're going to start with a presentation by my colleague, Mekala Krishnan, who's an MGI partner who leads all of our work on these topics. We will then shift to an interview that my co-author and co-MGI director, Sylvain Johansson, is going to run with Andreas Berger, who's the Group Chief Executive Officer of Swiss Re. And then we will close with roughly a 30 or 40-minute panel. And I'm very excited about this. I'm going to be facilitating it. It's with Arunabha Ghosh, who's the COP30 Special Envoy for South Asia, and he's also the founder and CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water. Marisa Drew, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer at Standard Chartered, and Kathleen McLaughlin, who's an EVP and the Chief Sustainability Officer at Walmart. So very much looking forward to this. As we go, you will see a question and answer tab, a Q&A tab as it's labeled on the right side of your screen. Please feel free to put questions in that. We'll also have a period at the end for dedicated questions and answers, but we will be trying to integrate them as we're presenting and talking. And so with that, over to Mekala.
Great. Thanks so much, Olivia, and it's a pleasure to join you all for this conversation. We were talking a little bit before the session started, and indeed to all of us, it does seem like adaptation has moved a bit from the sidelines to much more a core and central part of the climate agenda. We see this in various ways. We see this when we look at countries and their submission of national adaptation plans. At the end of last year, about 141 countries had submitted national adaptation plans. This is up from 84 5 years ago. And we see this in the form of companies that are increasingly thinking about the topic of adaptation. They may not always call it that. They may call it supply chain resilience or business continuity planning, but this is increasingly more and more a mainstream topic. And so we at MGI wanted to explore this in more detail, partly because there are, I think, profound gaps that still remain in the world's understanding of this topic. How do climate hazards manifest in different parts of the world? What adaptation measures actually work to manage those climate hazards? And perhaps most importantly, what does that cost? These were the types of questions we examined in our research and what we believe is the first comprehensive global, but at the same time, pixel by pixel geospatial analysis of adaptation. And as Olivia said, one that led to us mapping costs from cooling to coastal defenses. So I want to take you on a quick tour of quite a large body of work, so you'll bear with me as I try and condense a lot of analysis in a short amount of time. But I want to start with this slide that you've all been staring at for a few minutes now, not looking at the climate of the future, but actually starting with the world as it exists today. So we examined a range of climate hazards, 8 different types of hazards that spanned heat, drought, flooding, and wildfire. And we examined hazards in these categories of a magnitude that were substantial enough to lead to significant impacts and of a magnitude that is often linked to an adaptation response. Maybe an adaptation response that is not uniform in the world, is often tied to the standards that developed economies set for their own protection, but a material type of event. So we examined 8 of these. To understand how does the world experience these events even today? And the answer is what you see on this slide. All the blue shading on this slide indicates parts of the world that have at least some likelihood of experiencing at least one of a heat, wildfire, drought, or flooding event already today. And what that translates to is about 40% of land mass that is exposed to at least one of these climate hazards already today. Now, the good news is in response to this, there are various mechanisms that exist already today to manage these risks. The first of these is adaptation, which is the focus of this presentation right now. What do we mean by adaptation? Adaptation is essentially the exercise of putting in place measures that reduce either your vulnerability to climate events, should they occur. So an example of this might be elevating a home to reduce damages from flooding, or reduce exposure to that event, essentially, for example, building out of harm's way so you aren't exposed to a flood in the first place. But it's also important to note that adaptation is not the only mechanism that exists to manage climate impacts and climate risks. There are also two other types of mechanisms. There is the role that disaster support can play. So this is things like rebuilding post an event, post a climate event, and also the role of risk transfer, shifting the burden of damages through tools like insurance. So it's important to keep in mind this entire toolkit. The focus of my presentation will be on adaptation, but I'm sure we'll get into conversations related to both the role of insurance and disaster support as we get into the dialogue. So looking specifically at adaptation, the good news is that in response to the fact that 40% of the world already experiences climate hazards today, many places have implemented a variety of measures that are already proven and cost effective. And in fact, as we looked at this, we had a little bit of fun with this, but you can trace back measures like irrigation all the way to ancient Mesopotamia. You can trace back flood elevation to 500 BC and the Netherlands, which implemented artificial mounds to elevate homes from flooding. So in many ways, we've been doing this for centuries, if not millennia. And we have a wide and large adaptation toolkit to choose from. And so you see many examples of that on this slide here. This is, of course, by no means complete. But as we started to approach the work, what we needed to do was to narrow our focus a little bit for it to be tractable. And so to that end, what we did was to focus on 20 core adaptation measures, the ones you see highlighted on this page right now or showing up on this page right now. These are measures that were chosen because they were widely applicable across sectors. So they weren't specific to a given sector, but were relevant across sectors. They were also measures that could be implemented across a whole range of economies, so weren't specific to a certain region, were fairly commonly used already today. And regardless of what you believe about the eventual mix of adaptation solutions, it's clear that these measures will be a part of the toolkit in some way, shape, or form. So they extend from things like physical infrastructure, building sea dikes to protect against coastal flooding, but also things like air conditioning and fans to protect against the effects of heat. So our focus was on these 20. If you think about the 40% then of land area that I described exposed to climate events earlier on, and you think about these 20 adaptation measures, what is then the footprint of how these adaptation measures are implemented today? So if you move to the next slide, what we essentially find is that 40% of land area translates to about 4.1 billion people on the planet that are already exposed to some forms of heat, wildfire, flooding, or drought. Now, again, the good news is we have these proven measures, and you see that in the implementation of the measures. Of the 4 billion people or so, about 1.2 billion of those are already protected with at least one of those 20 measures already today. Not surprisingly, the vast majority of those people live in high and middle income places. About 64% of that 1.2 billion people that are protected live in high and middle income places. That's the good news. On the other hand, though, what we find is that already today, there is a resiliency gap with about 2.9 billion people on the planet that have limited protection. They're either unprotected entirely or are underprotected in some way. And the vast majority of these people live in low-income places, about 77%. So one big question facing climate adaptation, before we even talk about the future, is thinking about this resiliency gap today and how to protect people that are under or unprotected even today. But then, of course, the other part of the climate adaptation question is what we do going forward. And this matters because the climate is not going to be static at today's magnitude and intensity. The climate is expected to change. We examined about 25 different scenarios of the current trajectory of global emissions. And what we found with all of these 25 is that all of them anticipate an increase in emissions and warming due to that increase in emissions. Across the 25, what we find is that by about 2030, the world is due to hit 1.5 C of warming across these scenarios. And by about 2050, the world is due to hit about 2 C of warming. Now, this is not just 1.5 C for a given year. This is multi-decadal periods where the Earth will warm 1.5 C relative to pre-industrial levels or 2 C relative to pre-industrial levels. Now, why does this future warming matter for adaptation decisions being made today? It matters for two different reasons. The first is that adaptation measures that we're putting in place today often can come with long lead times to implement. Implementing something like a sea dike to protect against coastal flooding, or implementing something like undergrounding power lines to prevent ignition risk from wildfires, can take 10 years or longer to put in place. And so we need to start planning today also for these measures that would be needed in the future. And adaptation measures being put in place today also come with long lifetimes. So it's important to anticipate not just the climate of today, but also the climate of the future as we put in place these measures. Of course, this does not mean that warming stops at 2050, and on the current trajectory of emissions, warming is anticipated to increase beyond 2050, beyond that 2C. But the focus of our work was this 3-decade or so time frame because of this link with the nature of the adaptation decisions we're putting in place already today. So what does this actually do? What does this warming actually do to the climate? Remember the 40% of landmass that I described previously that is exposed to climate hazards today. With warming, with additional warming of 1.5C and 2C, those climate hazards are set to evolve. But maybe counter to the movie title that some of you may have seen, it's actually a complex picture. It's climate hazards that will evolve, but not everywhere, not in the same way, and not all at once. What do I mean by that? So you see the picture today, 40% of landmass exposed. If you fast forward to 1.5C, which is this slide here, what you see is that the land area exposed to at least one of those hazards across heat, wildfire, drought, or flooding expands. So more places are exposed. But these places are exposed, not everywhere is exposed. There are still white areas on this chart that are unexposed, and they're not exposed in the same way. By this, I mean there may be some places that are already experiencing climate hazards today that see an intensification of those hazards. For heat stress, for example, the world that experiences long periods of heat and humidity for 30 days or longer could see an increased intensification, longer periods of those such heat and humid conditions. We could also see places that do not experience climate hazards today start to experience them going forward. So, for example, parts of Europe that may start to experience periods of acute heat waves that last a week or longer. And in some instances, we may even see hazards decrease in intensity. So some parts of the world seeing drought and flooding start to decrease in their frequency as well as intensity. So it's important to recognize that this picture is not a uniform picture. It's not everywhere, not in the same way. And it's also not all at once. So if you fast forward to 2C, again, you see yet a changing picture. And all of this complexity is important to keep in mind as we think about adaptation, because it will need to account for these shifts, these changes, and these changes that happen quite differently in different parts of the world. And so that's exactly what we did, and we used to then estimate what it would cost to actually protect. We examined pixel by pixel on the planet, what the nature of hazards that different places are exposed to today and going forward at 1.5C and 2C. We looked at measures, those 20 measures, in a way that are implemented such that they're cost effective and physically feasible. By that, I mean measures that if we're thinking about the role of measures like mangroves, only applying them in places where mangroves can actually grow, so latitudes that mangroves can actually grow, and cost-effective, meaning measures that have benefits in terms of their avoided damages that exceed their costs. And we looked at their capital expenditures and operating expenditures. So you put all of that together, and what do you see? So let's start with the picture of today. As I mentioned before, 4 billion people or so in the world exposed to these hazards today, about 1 billion protected, 3 billion with limited protection. And so what all of that translates to is about $190 billion that the world spends annually today, capital expenditures and operating expenditures, to protect itself. An example of that you see in this little cartoon-like call-out is investing in air conditioners, for example, in a place like Arizona or in Dubai. But that leaves already today a gap, right? As we saw, 1 billion relative to 3 billion, where there's a gap in spending of about $350 billion already today to protect those 3 billion people with limited protection. So an example of this might be investing in air conditioners in India or Pakistan, places that have extreme heat conditions today, but may not have sufficient access to cooling technologies. So that's the today picture. But if we fast forward to 2C, then 2 additional things happen. As I described previously, more places start to experience an intensification of hazards that they already experience today. And so that adds another $190 billion in cost. So think about this as operating air conditioners for longer periods in a place like Arizona or Dubai. And more places start to become exposed to hazards they may not have previously experienced. So think about this like the European heat wave example that I described. And so that adds an additional $430 billion in cost. So put together, what this suggests is that implementing those 20 adaptation measures that we examined in a way that protects people around the world at exposure by 2C would cost $1.2 trillion a year annually, in both capital as well as operating expenditures. This is, of course, not the damages that these places would experience from climate events, but rather the investments that these places need to make to protect themselves from those damages. And the way that then breaks out into different measures is what we then see on the next page. I think this was quite an interesting view for us and maybe somewhat surprising as well, because oftentimes the headlines when it comes to climate and climate events is dominated by the shades of teal or blue on the right, thinking about flooding and damages associated with water. But actually what we found is that the vast majority of the costs are actually associated with the areas of pink on this slide, which is essentially due to heat. So if you take the entire 1.2 trillion and you break it down across the 20 measures, what we find is that the vast majority of costs to manage climate events at 2C will be heat related. And this is because large swaths of the world will become exposed to heat at 2C. The second biggest category is drought, and indeed air conditioning and irrigation together account for more than 50% of that $1.2 trillion of annual expenditure. The third biggest category then is various forms of flooding, where measures to protect are both gray infrastructure type measures, but also green infrastructure type measures like mangroves. And then finally, the last category is wildfires, which across the four is the smallest, but for specific regions will matter tremendously. If we also then think about the interesting question, which I'm sure the discussion in the panel will get into further, of how do these costs actually break down between private and public actors, what we essentially find is that about 50% of the cost, 50% of that 1.2 trillion, is in measures that private actors can undertake for themselves, and which protect themselves. So for example, this could be a company implementing an air conditioning measure or an individual using a fan. About 30% is in public-related spending, things like sea dikes or stormwater networks that protect many people. And about 20% are somewhere in between, could be implemented either by public or private actors. So an example of that is irrigation, which in some instances is implemented through public programs, in some instances through private actors. Now, I would be remiss at this point to say, if I didn't say that this is not only a question of cost. This is also a question of how effectively these measures are implemented. You're all probably looking at that large air conditioner chunk and thinking about the emissions associated with air conditioning, or looking at that irrigation chunk and thinking about how that might exacerbate water scarcity. But it's vital, therefore, to not just think about these as costs, but in the context of specific locations, think about how to implement these solutions well, how to prevent maladaptation risks and concerns, how to manage trade-offs and challenges. And it's also important to think about the role of innovation, because innovation can help improve the efficiency of measures, reduce their costs, and also come up with alternate technologies that may have lower maladaptation risk. This also then plays out quite differently across regions, and you see that with the various regions laid out on this page as rows. And essentially what emerges from this is that the costs associated with adaptation are the highest when it comes to India and China, the bubbles on the very right, both because these regions experience high hazards, but also because of large populations. But the cost as a share of GDP is the highest in sub-Saharan Africa, which would need to incur about 3% of GDP expenditures to protect itself at 2C. This is as much as the region spends on servicing external debt annually every year. So this is large expenditures for this part of the world. Now, despite the expenditures, the good news is that the expenditures actually have a benefit that is meaningful and a positive ROI. Adaptation overall, we find, is a good buy, with benefit to cost ratios exceeding 1.5, where the benefits in terms of avoided damages far exceed their costs. And about 80% of the costs are in measures that have a benefit of greater than 3, in fact. But all of this does not, of course, mean that spending will happen. If we think about already today, the fact that these measures have positive benefit to cost ratios, but the fact that 3 billion people remain unprotected and we're only spending about a third of what we could be spending on adaptation, it's far from clear that the full 1.2 trillion will be spent going forward. So we imagined various scenarios for how this could play out. One scenario where we just continue to protect at the levels at which we're continuing today, but we need to spend more because hazards intensify and become more expansive. And in that scenario, the world would need to increase spending by 2.5 times, spend $470 billion annually. As another scenario, of course, is the bookend of 1.2 trillion, where we spend the full amount, but that's a step up of 6 times of today's amount of spending. And somewhere in between is if we were to increase spending in line with economic growth, where the world would spend $670 billion, but protection gaps would still remain substantial, especially in low-income parts of the world. So that's a very, very quick tour of the research. There's a lot, of course, that individual actors can do. There's the role that households and individuals can play, governments, companies, financial institutions, as well as the role of managing any residual risks that remain through insurance and disaster relief, as I described previously. These are all, I'm not going to go through the details on the slide because this is all things that we'll discuss in the panel, but suffice to say there is a lot that can be done, but it will require a step change, a fundamental paradigm shift to what we're doing today. So with that, I am delighted to move to some of the discussions with the leaders that are actually driving these discussions, this agenda in different parts of the world. And we'll start with a pre-recorded fireside chat between my colleague Sylvain Johansson and Andreas Berger, Group CEO of Swiss Re. Thank you very much.
I'm delighted to be here in Zurich with Andreas Berger, the Group CEO of Swiss Re.
Thanks for having me, Sylvain.
Great to have you, Andreas. Thank you. This is Swiss Re is the world's biggest reinsurer and has long been at the frontier of risk transfer, but also innovations like cat bonds and parametric. Andreas has successfully led the primary corporate solutions business of Swiss Re for many years, and now in the Group CEO role, you also oversee the entire portfolio of reinsurance. And of course, being there for your clients, paying claims is an important part of a reinsurer, but Swiss Re has also been very active over the years in promoting the awareness of risk, talking about protection gaps, and increasing the resilience of societies. And if we take a pragmatic view of the world in the coming years, it's clear that we will have mitigation efforts, we'll need to do adaptation investments, and live with some increased residual risk. And we have seen in the latest McKinsey Global Institute report on adaptation that adaptation will be a good investment. And as an example, the benefits will outweigh costs by 7 to 1 if and when we get to a 2-degree world. So today we are very eager to hear Swiss Re's view on this topic and adaptation. And thanks again, Andreas, for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm very curious.
So Andreas, let's start. Let's shoot. So Swiss Re is one of the world leading authorities in natural catastrophe, and you have a privileged perspective on the extent of what's happening. And so, how would you describe where the world stands and where it's going on that front?
So unfortunately, the picture doesn't get better. So we collect data for more than 160 years. And as everybody knows, the Sigma report coming out of Swiss Re Institute, they give you the data. Yeah. Now, for the 6th consecutive year, we've seen insurance losses, natural catastrophe losses exceeding $100 billion. 24, it was 137 billion, and 25, 107 billion. So it went down a bit, but it's definitely exceeding the 100 billion threshold. And you will see it's not only the primary perils, it's the secondary. Primary perils like earthquake, hurricanes, but the secondary ones, wildfires, floods, for instance, that's the level where the increase is coming from. Yeah.
And, primary insurers, reinsurers, they play a key role in managing, transferring the risks. Do you think the importance of this sector and reinsurers will therefore increase in years to come?
100%. So there's an increased demand, and there's a discussion around insurability and or affordability. Yeah. So I think we all have to play our role now. So we have to increase our efforts as reinsurance company to not only explain what the risk is, but also to bring our instruments to the party. So that's not only capacity or balance sheet, but that's also data and really understanding of risk, so that the primary insurance companies can pass it on also to their end customers. Yeah.
And do you see challenges in continuing this mission of providing risk transfer in years to come?
I think the challenges, they reside really in understanding the risk and also having the right risk-reward profile. So it is at the end of the day about the composition of your portfolio. How do you diversify? If the global movement of capital is not so easily possible anymore, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
Because our model lives because we have this global diversification. Because the risks are not correlated. A hurricane in the US is not correlated with an earthquake in Japan, for instance.
Yeah.
But for the individual locally operating insurance companies, they need that global diversification. Otherwise, the prices will go through the roof, and then it really not only becomes an affordability issue, but also insurability issue.
And so we talked about risk transfer, and if we go a bit more on adaptation, societies, be it individuals, corporates, public authorities, will need to, do more and think about this more. And how do you see how insurers, reinsurers have a role to push the adaptation agenda moving forward?
Yeah, Sylvain, I really like that topic, and let me lean in here for a moment. It is really about making natural catastrophes and climate that always brings, it's always brought together with the natural catastrophe topic to a level. And I always say it's coming from morality, so the macro level, to materiality. Now using data, making it tangible, concrete for all constituencies, for public entities, for insurance companies, but also for corporates and households, personal households. So I think here we play a role because we've got data, we've got the right models, and we would just put a price tag on exposure, on risk, unemotionally. And I think that knowledge and the tools we need to make available to all our customer bases.
Yeah. And if we think about, to finish our webinar audience, we have many participants from actually a wide range of private sector companies, leaders in those. That goes from real economy, agriculture, utilities, all the way to financial institution of the sectors. And what is the one or two actions you would encourage these leaders in the private sectors to increase their preparedness in terms of adaptation?
Yeah, so for me, it's really about awareness of risk. And awareness is not enough. Quantification of risk.
Yeah.
That's step one. Why? Because you need to increase your resilience.
Yeah.
Secondly, you need to think about prevention and mitigation of risk. And thirdly, only then think about how do you risk finance. And risk transfer is one element. How can we support here? We can bring our data analytics, our models to the parties. We have developed a data platform where we forward integrate into our customer base.
Yeah.
It's their data and their platform. They create a digital twin of their reality. To give you an example. So all the physical assets, as an example, of a corporate, of a municipality, can be, or of an insurance company, will be put on that platform. It's a digital twin. And then we stress test the digital twin with our models and the events that we choose. Nat Cat, we choose a hurricane, a flood, whatever, and see how this digital twin behaves. And we give back actionable insights so that companies, insurers, but also public entities in particular, can then understand and quantify their risk and even do projections into the future. And that informs budget decisions for public entities or CapEx decisions for corporates. And that increases resilience. And the benefit for us as an insurance industry and reinsurance industry is that the data that comes into the insurance and reinsurance value chain is better.
Yeah.
Quality is better, granularity is higher. So our underwriting models can be fed with better data. So the outcome of risk covers will also be better in future. And
I love this. This is really a great example of there's really stuff that can be done by leaders in these sectors. And thanks for sharing this insight. Thanks for setting the tone for our webinar here with these really insightful comments. Andreas, thanks a ton.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Sylvain.
Thank you, Sylvain. Thank you, Andreas. After the fact. So I am delighted to introduce and welcome the panel. I introduced them before, but now coming on screen, Kathleen, Marisa, Arunabha, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
So Mekala said, and I think some of the interview we just had picked up on the fact that given what we look to be on, the path we look to be on towards 2050, there will need to be a sort of paradigm shift or step change in how we think about this question of adaptation. As you look in front of you today and what you're doing in your various organizations, what are you most excited about? And maybe Kathleen, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for having me here today, Olivia. It's great to be with everyone. I think there is a need for increasing focus and attention to adaptation for us and for many other retailers, though it's not new. We've been in the business of adaptation for many years now. And it's due to climate issues, but many other issues as well. And it's pretty integrated into our operations. I think one of the most exciting things is technology and how all of us can be using AI-enabled tools and other tech tools to get better at projecting risk from climate events, but also in solutions to respond to them. So in our own case, we did our first climate risk assessment a number of years ago. The most recent one that we did was along the lines of what Andreas was just talking about, where we can get much more specific, much more granular about the nature of a risk in a particular geography and how that might manifest then in terms of impact on our own operations and business continuity, in our supply chain and in our sourcing of critical commodities, and in the communities that we serve. So work we need to do around disaster preparedness and so on. And then similarly, we can be using technology to innovate around some of the solutions. So for example, we're now able, through our Emergency Operations Center, to be tracking real-time events, hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding events, and so on, and live redirect our truck drivers who are on the highway to take a particular exit and shelter in place and so on. We can see all of that, and we can use technology to predict and intervene in the moment. And perhaps we'll have a chance to share a few other examples from sourcing and operations resilience. But I'm excited about the potential of technology to help us get better and better at not only predicting or sizing risk, but innovating solutions to respond to it.
Responding. Marisa, what about you? What makes you excited right now?
Well, as you'd probably expect, given that I'm in financial services, where my excitement rests is in the innovation that's happening in finance to be able to create novel structures and dedicated pools of capital that are focused on adaptation. You know, when I started in the climate space, and I would think most of us who are climate practitioners, you know, some years ago, it was almost unseemly to talk about financial flows or climate finance going to adaptation, because the belief was we have to do everything to mobilize capital toward mitigation, so staving off global warming. And I think over the last couple of years, the recognition is no matter what we do, we're going to face these extreme weather events, and we need to have a balance of the capital flowing toward this topic. But then the next hurdle that we faced, certainly when we began to put this on the table, was a question from the private sector about, was this an investable opportunity? So if you're a commercial actor, a private sector actor, you know, the question was, well, gee, is this really a role for private sector actors, or is it just really a government job? And can I really generate a return? And I think Mekala so well pointed out in her opening comments about the fact that, you know, the return on investment of investing in adaptation, and you can look at it through many lenses, whether it's, you know, business interruption, whether it's actual physical loss, et cetera, you know, I think that penny has dropped, so to speak. It's certainly in my space where now we don't have to make the argument about whether or not one can generate a return. It's about, you know, how do we invest and what are the right places to invest to get the highest return, and then how do we interact with other actors in order to create that sort of multiplier effect, because in isolation, one can't just do it in the private sector. We need community engagement. We need our corporate clients to engage. We need, you know, public policy change, et cetera. And those are the kinds of discussions that we're having now. How do we maximize the outcomes by collaborating?
Okay. And Arunabha, a view from the front lines.
Olivia, I think two things excite me right now, especially if I think back 5 years and compare it to where we are right now. One is in line with what Kathleen was saying and with what Andreas was saying in the recorded interview, a much better granular understanding of risk.
Yeah.
the study that you guys have released, and Mekala, congratulations on leading this, of course, is global in nature. The region I'm coming from, South Asia, my organization, we've developed the first high-resolution climate resilience atlas for India, initially at a district, state level, then district level, then sub-district. We've got over 4,500 sub-districts, and now down to village and neighborhood levels. So we are developing heat action plans at a neighborhood by neighborhood level for hundreds of cities. That granularity really helps various types of stakeholders to act. But the other thing that excites me is that, sort of building on what Mekala was saying, whether you go back 500 BC or just 5 years ago, communities have actually been on the front lines for much longer than we in our living rooms have recognized. And I think what's happening now is we are beginning to notice that community action can actually play out at scale. And when I look beyond India, I'm COP30 Special Envoy for South Asia, I see that, for instance, a program in Nepal called the Community Forest User Groups basically has community-owned ownership and management of nearly 40% of the country's forests. In Bhutan, about 10,000 households are stewarding about 50% of the country's ecosystems. You realize that community action then is not just a feel-good case study, but something that can actually be deployed at scale while marrying it with that hyper-local, granular, analytical work that is also necessary to guide administrators or investors.
And may I just jump in on that? One of the things that certainly as we think about learning from history, we certainly find, if you think about agriculture, for instance, practices by indigenous populations in local communities over thousands of years, from a farming point of view, they've used practices which are highly adaptive. They really understand that local flavor. And when we're trying to have some lessons learned that can be, shared somewhere else, whether it's, drought-resistant crops or the way you farm, these sorts of things, we've sort of lost a little bit of that along the way in industrialization. And I think if we kind of go back to some of those practices, what we see is they were highly efficient, and highly adaptive. And I think that shared learning is an interesting, topic for us to explore a little bit too. A lot of that came out at COP. That was a moment for me to really explore with that adaptation lens how we can have some shared learning across borders.
So maybe let me continue with the thread for a second of community action. As Mekala discussed, if you think about where we are today, the biggest delta going forward to 2050 and a perspective to see world in 2050 as we analyzed is the step up in heat and the necessity to adapt to heat. Can you say something about what role community action plays there, if you will? Arunabha.
Well, as Mekala also pointed out in her presentation, we thus far we've been thinking about climate impacts in terms of the visible impacts we see, whether it's a flood or a drought or a cyclone or a storm surge. Heat is the sort of chronic underbelly of climate risk. And one of the things that we are observing is how, at a community level, building materials are being experimented with. Because the kind of homesteads or huts, etc., you would build in a village might not be any more necessarily adaptive enough for the kind of heat stress you're going to get. So you go back in a way, away from cement-based kind of paka homes, back to something which is much more traditional and much more heat adaptive. The second thing you see about heat is actually that it impacts not just humans but plants. Plants catch fever as well. And how heat resilient crops that can be driven by community action. Particularly, we see this in the role of agroforestry, natural farming, which is driven primarily by smallholder farmers. In Andhra Pradesh, which is a very heat-stressed state in India, over 1.5 million farmers are now practicing natural farming. Just up north from there, Odisha, huge focus on millets. Why I'm saying this is that heat is not just what you feel on the day. It's this kind of chronic tension that impacts the humans as well as the economy, and we are seeing adaptation in line with that.
So maybe we've talked about both the challenge and some things that are exciting today. Just a moment on the sort of sobering reality of it, even today. As Mekala said, our analysis indicates that about $190 billion a year is spent today. It also indicates that were everybody to be adopted to a sort of notional set of developed world standards, even today we would be spending $540 billion, right? So about 2.5 times what we're actually spending. Do you see that there's momentum that's different today from what there was 5 years ago that might close that gap?
I
That's what I
certainly can
would
speak.
say.
Sure. Go ahead, please, Kathleen.
Sorry. Just to jump in, I think that capital comes in many, many forms. So some of that's going to need to be spent by governments through large-scale infrastructure projects. Some will be financed through the innovative products that you're creating, Marisa. And then some will happen in the course of business. So let me just give a few examples. So one would be sourcing, which for us as a retailer is significantly impacted by climate risk and something we're focused a lot of our adaptation on. And Arunabha, you just gave some examples of smallholder farmers. So let me give a few other examples. Rice. So we are working with growers to innovate rice production to use less water. And that's critically important because of water stress, and so much of the water in the world does go for agriculture. So one project, as an example, is in Arkansas, working with local farmers and with nonprofit groups, as well as the government in the state of Arkansas, to innovate on the ground. And through that project, which now supplies a large portion of our great value rice, which is our opening price point rice, there have been investments in irrigation methods, different kinds of inputs that not only have reduced the water stress and water usage, but also reduced nutrient runoff into the Mississippi and surrounding watershed, and increased the yields for the farmer. So net, you can have a solution by taking a more holistic approach to the problem that generates economic benefits while adapting to climate and reducing the water stress in the area and making water more available for other uses. That's one example. We're similarly working with many smallholders in India, in Mexico, and Central America, about 1 million smallholders in those regions, strengthening the farmer-producer organizations to help them not only improve market access, agricultural techniques, value-added addition and so on, but also to integrate regenerative practices that help adapt to heat and to water stress and so on. And that's just happening in the course of those initiatives, and the investments required to do those things are done in a context where there can be other sources of value that help pay for that. Or technologies, we're using technologies now. So for example, cherry sourcing. We can actually go into our orchards and use technology to predict the yields based on the weather events recently in those orchards. And by having diversified sources and working with the farmers on their other crops, we can help rebalance where the supply will come from based on weather events in a way that helps the farmers with their income, but also ensures surety of supply for our customers. So those are a few examples from sourcing and ag where you're seeing people integrate adaptive techniques into their methods of production in a context where they're solving for the investment needs using other levers to make the projects pencil.
If I shift you and sort of say, well, what about the sort of supply chains beyond your ag supply chain that you're dealing with across the globe? What are some of the things that you're thinking about in order to make sure that those are resilient to climate events?
So similar levers. So whether you're talking about sourcing apparel or food, The first thing is, where can technology help reduce or mitigate stress, especially things like water or heat? So cooling technologies in factories or reducing water usage, those kinds of things. So that's the first thing, is innovation around the methods of production themselves. Second is around varietals, and I think you mentioned this, Arunabha, different varieties of crops that are more resilient under different conditions. And that's something that farmers are always innovating for anyway, to produce different taste profiles, different shelf life, but also climate resilience is an important thing. The third thing is just looking at the sourcing footprint and optimizing the growing regions or source regions for different kinds of commodities. Most of what we source at Walmart for our businesses in the US or Canada or Mexico or what have you comes locally. So over 2/3 to 90% of what we source in a given market comes from that country, but there are always things that come beyond televisions, avocados, and so on might come from different regions. So using the climate risk insights to develop additional future capacity in more climate resilient regions is something that a lot of retailers are focused on, and we are as well, while continuing to really cultivate local supply, because that tends to be more resilient. You have less transportation risk, you've got things closer to home, has a lower carbon footprint, as well. So those are the kinds of things that we're experimenting with, and I would say retailers in general are experimenting with. And those investments happen in the context of the production itself. And as I said, in terms of, how do you pay for that? It's done in the context of a broader set of problem solving and different levers that you can pull to make the overall profile of that product still affordable for the customers then that also need to access that product.
So something that's helping the customer, but also really has a business case to do rather than not to do, if I understand. Marisa, if I turn to you and ask about the question of business case through the lens of a bank. Business case?
Yeah, well, actually, interestingly enough, what I love that Kathleen talked about is, as a corporate, experimenting on everything from varietals to other products that she's sourcing. But if by that experimentation she has an assurity of supply, what do? I'm a bank, I'm a financier, and I'm looking at my lending book through credit risk lens. And if there is less business interruption and she's doing all those wonderful things at Walmart, two things can happen. One, she's a better credit because she is already thinking about adapting to those potential risks, which would otherwise possibly impair my lending book. Not to Walmart, given their financial wherewithal, but I think you get the point. But also, we are a big supply chain finance bank. So often, as you rightly point out, when we get to the very end of the supply chain to a smallholder farmer, the question is, yes, I'd love to do all these things, but who's going to pay for this? And often we stand in the middle. So if we have the demand signal from the large corporates that say, I'm prepared to buy if you do it this way, then I know that they will do it this way. And we are then able to stand in and provide the finance, because we both know that we've got a buyer, but we also know that the way that the adaptation is happening is going to make sure that the underlying credit risk of that end of the supply chain is very much there. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other exciting bit is that we see more traditional actors in finance, including private equity, who wouldn't normally be your typical place that you would think that you would see investment flowing to adaptation. But we've got a wonderful success case of the first very dedicated private equity fund that was raised exclusively to invest in businesses that are creating goods and services for adaptation. Their target returns are 20 to 25%, so right there with what I would call traditional tier one private equity. Their fund is fully deployed, and they've got a pipeline that almost won't quit, and they're extremely excited about all those opportunities. So it can be anything from the weather forecasting businesses that Kathleen talked about, all the way through to the manufacturing of products that are more resilient. Maybe I can give you another example as a wonderful what we called adaptation finance activity was for a very traditional solar panel manufacturer out of China, which is where most of these panels come from. Their historical product was very traditional, but they saw an increasing need with extreme weather events in hurricane and sandstorm prone areas where you have big sandstorms and that pits the solar panels so they become ineffective. And obviously in a hurricane, if it rips off the roof, then you're off the grid, to produce a specific adaptive panel product, very specific line. We provided an adaptation financing to support that manufacturing line for them to then export that across the globe to all these areas. So that's the type of financing that a bank can do to promulgate the more production of these types of goods and services. And maybe I can point to one final thing, which is touching on the intersection between adaptation and nature. One of the things that we are learning with all of this technology, particularly on the sensor side, and thinking about going back to historical practice, is that often nature is one of the more adaptive solutions if we protect and restore it. So, Mekala, you referenced investing in mangroves. They're applicable in certain circumstances. They can be a highly, highly effective and less expensive barrier protection in coastal storm surge areas. And then they have the co-benefit, of course, feeding the marine economy, which feeds off of the mangroves. But not only are they cheaper, but from a longevity point of view, so when you move from CapEx to OpEx, when you do have a lot of storm activity, they don't degrade and fall apart into the marine system. They actually become more healthy as there's sort of more activity going on. The mangroves get stronger. So it's an interesting lens to think about when we think about what are some of the solutions that we can turn to from an adaptation lens point of view versus traditional.
And if I can just jump in on one other thing related to that. We also can offer and do offer products, customer solutions through our business, and that's a growing revenue stream for us. So things like managing your home, energy efficiency, air purifiers. A lot of our customers, unfortunately, are in areas prone to wildfires. Cooling solutions, low emissions cooling solutions. Things that are really around how do you adapt to a changing climate, disaster preparedness, products and services. Those are all through our business. And then for about 20 years now, we've been quite invested in helping communities prepare for disaster and being there to help respond for disaster. We have parking lot activations where we provide food and first responder services, facilities for people to shower and wash their clothes and get a hot meal, those kinds of things in community in the moment, both to help prepare for disaster, but also help respond.
So the financial equation or the business equation of paying for some of this stuff in richer parts of the world can look a little bit different from where it looks in lower income parts of the world. It's a different equation associated with building flood protection. It's a different equation associated with whether or not somebody can afford a cooling solution, et cetera. Arunabha, what are your thoughts about what is happening and what will need to happen going forward to finance things in the developing world?
I think the first thing that has to happen, firstly, Marisa and Kathleen, great examples, and we need more of those, whether it's in the rich parts of the world or poorer parts of the world. We need much more spotlighting of those examples to give confidence to others who are trying to do things differently. Nevertheless, I think the first thing that needs to happen is for us to recognize that there is a difference between an economic case and a financial case. And there is clearly an economic case in investing in adaptation. And yet there might not be a financial case for this particular entity. Now, that particular entity, if it's not, say, in the Walmart supply chain, might just be a standalone small medium enterprise that does not have that pull of a large enterprise's supply chain and therefore invests in it. Similarly, if it's a smallholder farmer who doesn't have those big sort of off-takers, might not find the kind of financial credit or credit history to be able to make that kind of investment. So what do we do about that? We need to figure out the non-financial approach towards aggregating those opportunities as well. And I think there is a case for climate smart governance dashboards where you are at least attempting to harmonize the type of intervention, whether it's in one part of the country or in a particular kind of sector, so that broadly the investor knows that this is a standardized portfolio into which investment can go. The second thing that needs to happen is that we do need a degree of public or development finance to at least de-risk these investments. And this is not just about small businesses, smallholder farmers. Even small cities, right? Those mayors don't have the balance sheets, the wherewithal to raise the muni bonds at scale. So again, if you say aggregate 300 small cities across South Asia or across Southeast Asia, how do you bolster their balance sheets? It's not going to happen city by city. It's going to happen at a sort of landscape level, at a population scale level. But it requires the de-risking that development finance institutions are meant to do, or where limited amounts of public capital can be leveraged. And the third and final thing I would say, going back to the more positive examples that Kathleen and Marisa were giving, that even in the poorer parts of the world, there is a huge but untapped business opportunity in leveraging nature-based solutions. We just estimated in India, we looked at 13 different value chains just in the nature-based and bioeconomy sectors. In 2020 dollars, by 2047, when India will be a 100-year-old country, an independent country, that will be about $400 billion of additional GDP. This is just the nature-based solutions. We've looked at bioeconomy, we've looked at circular economy. So overall, it's a $4 trillion investment opportunity. So there is a massive fortune at the proverbial bottom of the pyramid. And I think our job is to try and marry the crisis with the opportunity.
So a question from the audience that I hope will pick up some of the threads of things people have said is, person says, in India, but a more general question, it's hard to get money to fund studies or analysis or data gathering that gives you a sense of the granular information that you in fact need. Kathleen, you talked about the incredible importance of data and what technology can do. Andreas talked about its importance and what Swiss Re is doing. How do we make sure that everybody has the data they need to make sure that they're making good decisions? Thoughts on well, you maybe Arunabha, you look like you're going to say something.
Well, I mean, of course, it's I run a think tank that's always looking to raise money.
There you go.
So thank you for that question, and sign the check, please. Thank you. But we've been investing in this for over nearly a decade. This granular attempt at developing a high-resolution climate resilience atlas, and actually, very soon in the coming months, we will make all our work into a digital public good for others to use. And then insurance companies can build on that and make products out of it. So that's our contribution. But, the more hands at the wheel, the better.
I do think, I would have to say that I do see a lot of actors thinking about this in the public good context of providing that data. And whilst that may seem altruistic, the investment that creates, or that opportunity that creates for adapting and resilience has a real return to it that I think sometimes we try to put these things in boxes, and I think we miss a little bit the point. So maybe I can give you an example that I found very provocative. I was sitting in one of these classic sort of climate circles where you had a variety of actors around the table, both in financial services, but also in the tech world. And it was one of those moments where we were having a discussion about California wildfires. And in many cases, one would say that those areas are now uninsurable, because it was very easy for the insurance companies after those massive payouts to say, I'm just not going to go there. And yet, the tech person in the room said, I have such granular data, I can tell you with precision where the line is in this particular forest that's susceptible, or this area, and not susceptible. Or I can tell you with precision that when we rebuild, if you put these shrubs around your house, the likelihood that it'll catch fire, et cetera, all these things, and the financial impacts of exiting that market, you can imagine, right, is the real estate impact, the migration impact if you can't rebuild your house because you can't get insurance. I mean, that multiplier effect is absolutely massive. And so providing that data, that is something that the insurance companies use, that the municipalities want and need, because this is the resilience for their own local economies, is something that they are going to absolutely need to rely on. So I think sometimes joining these dots and not having us be in these boxes about who does what where and whether it's a public good or a private good, thinking a little bit differently and with a little bit more of an expansive lens will help benefit us all in the space.
Well, indeed, if we're operating in a world as we find, in which the benefit to cost ratio is 7 or 8 to 1, because it's economic benefits, how do we make sure that those economic benefits are actually realized and people invest what they need to make sure that happens? With that, your time is unfortunately very, very short, and we're up against it. Kathleen, Marisa, Arunabha, thank you so much for joining, and thank you everybody for being on. We really appreciate your participation. We will also have a link if you want to see a replay of this. And as always, we very much welcome your feedback. And so if you do have a moment to give us some, we'd very much appreciate it. Thank you.